In mid-June 2024, Russia's President Vladimir Putin made his first visit to North Korea in 24 years. During Putin's visit to the country, Russia and North Korea signed a landmark defense partnership, with a pledge for immediate military assistance should either state be invaded or in a state of war, and a commitment to jointly oppose unilateral sanctions. The two states pledged to bolster cross-border cooperation in trade, economy, investment, and science and technology. The two countries also agreed to joint research in what they considered to be the peaceful use of nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, and information technology. You're listening to Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose, an international relations and security policy podcast brought to you by Andrew Jose, a Washington, D.C.-based security policy analyst and news reporter. Joining Andrew today is nuclear historian Peter Kuznick. Andrew Jose and Peter Kuznick will be discussing the impact the rapprochement between Russia and North Korea will have on the global nuclear non-proliferation regime and the security environment in Northeast Asia.
Peter Kuznick is the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C. He's the author of Beyond the Laboratory: Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America and co-author of the books Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives, and the book Nuclear Power and Hiroshima: The Truth Behind the Peaceful Use of Nuclear Power. His most consequential work has been a series of books and the 12-part documentary film series he worked on with filmmaker Oliver Stone titled The Untold History of the United States, which was a New York Times bestseller for 7 weeks and was watched by millions around the world. Kuznick's work and commentary have appeared in several notable outlets, including The Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, and Reuters. Dr. Kuznick, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Andrew.
Dr. Kuznick, in your assessment, what do you think is the significance of Russia's new agreement with North Korea, and how will the agreement affect the global nuclear non-proliferation regime?
Russia, feeling both isolated and attacked, has been threatening to do certain aggressive things that it seems to be acting upon now. It has said that, when we look at the broader picture, especially in terms of the war between Russia and Ukraine right now, NATO has been escalating. We've seen a series of steps, more and more financial and military aid, more advanced weapon systems, French President Macron threatening to send French and other NATO troops, combat troops, into Ukraine, providing more and more advisors, new weapon systems, the ATACMS, the tanks, the F-16s that are coming in there, the need for NATO advisors for targeting, for running these weapon systems, the permission given by the United States and others for Ukraine to use its advanced weapons to attack sites inside of Russia, the current NATO summit meeting reaffirming the commitment to Ukraine. All of this going on has put Russia in a position where, even though it's on the offensive inside of Ukraine, globally, it is in certainly a defensive situation, as it sees the West, the U.S. and NATO, erasing or ignoring all of Russia's red lines and pushing for an increasingly NATO-Russia military confrontation. What we've seen going on has been a proxy war. What we see in the future could be a direct war, World War III even. And so Putin's response has been to firm up his alliances, to show that he's not isolated on the world scene, and to make increasing threats against NATO as well. I see what happened in terms of the agreement between Russia and North Korea in that context. So Putin is willing to go further in threatening Western interests than he had been willing to go before. And he had said, especially in the aftermath of permission for Ukraine to attack inside of Russia, he said that he is going to provide nuclear technology and possibly nuclear arms to some of his allies, even though it's very, very destabilizing. I think we're on a very dangerous path right now on all sides. So we see, while the NATO summit is going on here in Washington, what is Putin doing? He's welcoming Narendra Modi from India to Moscow, and they reaffirmed their close ties and friendship. He's also gone on the speaking and engagement tour, where he went to North Korea, also Vietnam, and to Vietnam is very crucial. The United States has been trying to win Vietnam over to supporting the U.S. side in the confrontation with China in the Pacific. Putin has also recently visited with Xi Jinping in China. He's also met just this past week with the head of the Hungarian government. So we see instance after instance where Putin is trying to show that not only is he not isolated, but he's winning right now globally. And the fact that the global South has refused to go along with the Western demands for sanctions, for isolating Putin, the global South really is the driver right now. You look at the situation. Europe represents 17% of the world economy. Asia represents 54% of the world economy. So what is going on at the summit meeting in Washington, the NATO summit, has been reaching out to the IP4, to New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, to try to draw them in as part of this broader global NATO. But even that is getting a lot of resistance. When they tried to open up the NATO office in Tokyo, France rejected that, and they were not able to do so. But what we see going on, in my view, is a growing militarization of the planet. And we see both sides doing it. The United States calling the shots and moving aggressively toward the militarization of the Pacific with AUKUS and the Quad and the IP4 and other measures that it's taking. And we see a Russian response, which is further militarizing the situation and leading toward the potential for a greater confrontation. So we look at the South China Sea. We look at the Straits of Taiwan. We look at what's going on in Okinawa right now. All of this is pointing in the wrong direction. And so I'm very, very concerned.
One of the things you've suggested in your commentary work, notably your article for Responsible Statescraft titled "Prolonging the Ukraine War is Flirting with Nuclear Disaster," is that the longer the Ukraine war continues, the closer we get to a nuclear showdown. Putin, on many occasions, has threatened to use nuclear weapons if Russia's interests are challenged, but in many ways, he has held back on delivering on those threats. Would it be safe to say that among the Russian government, there are cooler heads that are prevailing as opposed to the caricatures that Washington and its allies make of the Russian side as being irrational and driven by primordial hatred? So is it safe to say that there is responsible behavior among the Russian side which Washington should not take advantage of?
Well, Andrew, Putin has been careful to identify the circumstances under which Russia would be provoked into using nuclear weapons. And he said that, number one, if there's an attack on Russia with nuclear weapons and possibly other weapons of mass destruction, and number two, if Russia is facing an existential crisis in which its existence as a nation is being threatened. Now, Putin has said that, but not only has Putin said that, we've heard this from Medvedev, Lavrov, Peskov, and others. So what we know that's going on inside Russia is that Russia has its hawks and it has not its doves, it has its less extreme elements. Putin, oddly, is positioned somewhere in the middle. And Putin is under pressure from his hawks in the same way that Biden has been pressured by his hawks. You have to remember that Biden came to office with 18 top advisors from the Center for New American Security. Mm-hmm. And these are the latest generation of hawks. They were like the Committee on the Present Danger under Reagan. They're like the Project for a New American Century under George W. Bush. Now, these people are mostly China hawks, and there's many of them see Ukraine as a distraction, and they would like to get Ukraine over with so they can really focus on what they call the pacing threat, and that's China. We see a RAND report titled Avoiding a Prolonged Struggle, calling for ending the fighting in Ukraine so we can get on with China. I thought it was very revealing recently when the decision came about who to choose to replace Wendy Sherman as the number 2 in the State Department. Victoria Nuland, the leading China hawk, the leading Russia hawk, had been occupying that position, but she was passed over by Kurt Campbell, who was the leading China hawk. And I think that clearly reveals America's top priorities, which is to go after China, even more than to go after Russia. But you ask about the dynamics, the internal dynamics in Russia. What we've seen is Russia positioning nuclear weapons in Belarus, just like the United States has positioned nuclear weapons in 5 countries in Europe. Now the U.S. is modernizing those as well. Whereas the U.S. has had nuclear drills targeting Russia, Russia has carried out tactical nuclear drills on the Ukrainian border inside of Russia, which are unprecedented as well. So we've seen nuclear threats being bandied about by both sides. Now, the reason why Ivana Hughes and I said that the main threat comes from Russia more than from NATO is that, unlike during the Cold War, Russia actually has, or NATO has, conventional superiority. And NATO would not have to resort to nuclear weapons as quickly as Russia might in a dangerous confrontation. And so I think that the threat of using tactical nuclear weapons, we know that we think Russia has a doctrine to escalate to de-escalate. So it is about nuclear signaling to show how serious they are by using a tactical nuclear weapon in the expectation that NATO will back down. Well, there's no guarantee for that, of course. And the danger is, of course, that NATO meets that tactical nuclear weapon with 1 or 2 tactical nuclear weapons of its own. And from there, the likelihood of reaching a stopping point before the entire planet is a smoking mess before we trigger nuclear winter and pretty much all life on the planet is ended, becomes quite possible and a realistic possibility. Biden has effectively said as much. And Biden has said that for that reason, he avoids going to war with Russia or doing anything that's going to provoke a World War III between the U.S. and Russia. but his actions are quite the opposite. The other thing that's going on that we haven't even mentioned yet is that while this NATO summit is taking place, while these confrontations in the Pacific are taking place, Biden is in such a precarious position, especially after that latest debate. It is sad to think that the fate of the United States, the Western world, and possibly the human race may lay in the hands of a mentally challenged, sleep-deprived, 81-year-old narcissist, a community college English professor, and a convicted felon who was a former drug addict. These three people are the ones who are, weighing whether or not Biden should step out of this race. I mean, it boggles the mind to think who's got control over the future destiny of our planet right now. One of the two people right now who has veto power over the future existence of the human race. That's Joe Biden. The other one, not much more comforting, but a little more rational and sane, is Vladimir Putin. And Xi Jinping, if China really does plan to get 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035, as the Pentagon alleges, would be the third person to have veto power over the future existence of humanity. So we are in not only a precarious situation, we are in a strange-like situation that the only way, we have to bring back Stanley Kubrick, or I can get my friend Oliver Stone to make this movie. We need a remake of Dr. Strangelove, because the only way, as Kubrick understood back in 1964, to make that movie is to do it as a black comedy. And it boggles my mind. I hope, and we realize, Tulsi Gabbard, I like Tulsi. I don't always agree with her. But she did tell the New York Times a few years back that she was reading and watching Untold History of the United States, my project with Oliver Stone, and she said, every leader needs to watch this and read this. Well, Tulsi has said recently that when Biden was asked, and when Biden said there's only one existential threat, and that's climate change, Tulsi said, is he kidding? The man who's got possession of the nuclear codes, the man who's got his finger on the nuclear button, doesn't understand that nuclear war represents an existential threat to mankind? We are in much more danger than people realize.
One of the provisions that the Russia-North Korea treaty has is that both countries have agreed to cooperate on, quote, the peaceful use of nuclear power. President Vladimir Putin, in response to the West sending loads of lethal weapons to Ukraine, has threatened, as you have mentioned, to send weapons to entities that are fighting Western interests. When it comes to Putin saying that he would cooperate with North Korea on nuclear issues, do you see this as something that is more of a threat, something like a protest vote, or do you think Putin would actually follow through on his statements?
Putin certainly has technologies that would be crucial for North Korea, that North Korea desperately wants to get a hold of. And, these could be to actually accelerate North Korea's missile programs. They could be to provide the technology that North Korea wants and needs for its nuclear submarines. If you look at the statement that they released, they talk about working together to challenge, I'll read this, I think this is the exact wording, working together to tackle challenges and threats on the areas of strategic significance, including food, energy security, information and communication technology, climate change, health and supply chains, and goes on to specify space, biology, peaceful use of nuclear energy, artificial intelligence, and information technology. These have got serious military implications. And we know that North Korea is providing Russia with artillery shells, enormous numbers of artillery shells, and other kinds of ammunition, as well as ballistic missiles that it's using in Ukraine. So with all of that going on, I think what Russia could provide North Korea would be enormously significant and enhance North Korea's military capabilities. Whether they're going to provide them with more nuclear weapons or assist them. You know, one of the sad things about that is that after North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, Russia and China both went along with UN sanctions to try to punish North Korea and try to limit nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula. And now Russia is vetoing those measures in the UN Security Council and will possibly be actually enhancing nuclear proliferation by encouraging and providing the technology that North Korea needs. So that's not a good sign for me. Mm-hmm. It's a reflection, and that's why I blame both sides for what's going on. Much like with Ukraine, I was opposed from the beginning of Russia invading Ukraine, but I understood the ways in which it provoked. I understood how it could be avoided. I understood what NATO expansion to Russia's doorstep and the threat of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO meant to Russia. I understood what putting advanced NATO weaponry as well as trainers into Ukraine meant to Russia. And so I think there's more than enough blame to go around. Just as I think in the South China Sea, Xi Jinping talks about win-win diplomacy. But when I look what's happening in the South China Sea, much of what I see is not win-win. It's more along the lines of the United States' approach to zero-sum game diplomacy. As Reagan put it, we win and you lose. The South China Sea is rich in resources. There's more than enough to be shared. Now, we often talk about China's 9-dash line and how crazy that is. Well, you look, Vietnam, Brunei, the Philippines, all the countries in that region make expansive claims to what they deserve and what is their rightful territory and resources. It's not just China, but I see China's hardline policy toward India, toward the Philippines, Vietnam, and others being self-defeating because it gives the United States and the West an opening. It gives them the maneuvering room, the legitimacy to push for their policies, which I see as a policy of militarization. I've given several webinars about the militarization of the Pacific. And I think that that's quite unfortunate, but that's the reality. You know, one of the people who I like to talk about is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, in my view, was a terrible president. Sadly, so. But I think he's been a terrific ex-president. And Jimmy Carter said back in 2019, he was only 94 years old at the time, and he said to churchgoers, he said that Donald Trump had called him up that week and talked about his concerns about China. And Jimmy Carter said in his talk to the congregation at the church, he said, since 1979, do you know how many times China's been at war with anybody? Carter asked, he said, and he answered, none. And we have stayed at war. He said that during the entire 242-year history of the United States, the country has only known a paltry 16 years of peace, which makes it the most warlike nation in the history of the world. He went on to say, we force other countries to adopt our American principles. He says, well, how many miles of high-speed railroad do we have in this country? And he says 0, while China's built 18,000 miles of high-speed rail, while the U.S. has wasted, I think, $3 trillion on military spending. It's more than you can imagine. China hasn't wasted a single penny on war. That's why they're ahead of us in almost every way. He said that we'd taken that $3 trillion and put it in American infrastructure, we'd have $2 trillion left over. We'd have high-speed railroad. We'd have bridges that aren't collapsing. We'd have roads that are maintained properly. Our education system would be as good as that of, say, South Korea or Hong Kong. I mean, I think that there's a real wisdom in what Carter said. And I think that U.S. policy has too often been blind and self-defeating. I think China's had sometimes been too. But I agree with a lot of what Jimmy Carter said there.
In the lead up to the Ukraine war, and as early as 2014, Dr. John Mearsheimer warned the West about leading Ukraine down the primrose path to misery with a future war that he correctly predicted. And one of the things I've thought about when I considered the situation in Taiwan, I've thought of writing op-eds, but eventually I did not have the time. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts on, are we in the West leading Taiwan too down a primrose path like Ukraine to its own ruin? So is it possible that just like the West has done with Russia in playing a part in provoking the war, any war in Taiwan would be more provoked than something that China desires to carry out?
Well, again, this is blame to go around, but most of that blame goes with the United States. And Obama and Hillary Clinton, was actually Obama and then Hillary Clinton had the article in Foreign Policy magazine in October 2011 titled America's Pacific Century, where she discusses the Asia pivot. Obama was doing it at the same time, and it didn't really happen under Obama. Obama focused more on Europe. Obama had the wisdom to say that Ukraine is a much greater security interest of Russia's than it is of the United States. And so he refused to send lethal aid to Ukraine. But Donald Trump did not hesitate, and he sent lethal aid to Ukraine. And Donald Trump was the one who really doubled down on the increased diplomatic and military ties with Taiwan that have provoked the crisis over Taiwan, the crisis with China. It had been managed before that. The United States had its one China policy. The United States had been, come to Taiwan's defense, but it maintained strategic ambiguity. Unlike under Biden, the United States' strategic ambiguity was that we were not going to say whether we would come to Taiwan's military defense if there was a war with China. But Biden has said on 4 separate occasions at least that the United States would do so militarily. Trump and now Biden have waged a trade war against China, have elevated the China threat from being an adversary to being really an enemy of the United States, or from being a competitor to an adversary and now an enemy. They've certainly increased diplomatic ties. And it's not only Trump and Biden, that absurd visit by Nancy Pelosi, which was provocation for the sake of provocation. And since that point, China has increased its provocative actions in the Taiwan Strait, going across the midline there repeatedly with its ships as well as its warplanes. So I think there's another crisis that could have and should have been avoided that now has been inflamed and provoked, and that we could step back from and maybe, get it back on a peaceful footing where we can have a peaceful resolution of this conflict. Now, I can understand why the Taiwanese do not want to become part of China. China, to me, is not the most attractive country in the world domestically. The Chinese have done remarkable things in terms of economic growth, in terms of alleviating poverty, at times in terms of playing a role as a peacemaker over Ukraine and other situations. But I don't like the idea of a country that's got 300 million surveillance cameras that monitors people as closely as it does, that doesn't allow more freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You know, I like democracy. I'm a big advocate of democracy. I wish we had more of that in the United States. The idea that this one clown, elderly figure, a warmonger of the first degree, the person who helped bring us Clarence Thomas, we could go through all the terrible things that Biden has done, supporting the invasion of Iraq. This is not a wise man, in my opinion. He's not an evil man. He's not a Donald Trump. He's certainly not a fascist. He believes to some extent in democracy, but the latest polling says 85% of the American people think Biden is too old. Even the Democrats think that Biden should step down. The American people do overwhelmingly, and the fact that this old fool will not listen, will not do so, and listens to Jill Biden and Hunter Biden instead of the American people is, to me, also beyond belief. So I think that, yes, the Taiwan situation is very dangerous. Biden has done what he can to inflame it. And if we get somebody else there, hopefully we can back down and restore diplomacy, which the Chinese would welcome as well. The last thing they want is a war with the United States over Taiwan. You know, and the other thing to keep in mind is that there's no guarantee the U.S. wins that war. The Pentagon has run at least 18 war games over a war between U.S. and China over Taiwan, and China has prevailed in all 18. There are Pentagon figures who say if we're going to have the war, we better get it over with by 2020. Some say 2025, some say 2027. It was Army General Minihan who said he thinks the U.S. and China will be a war by 2025. Others predict that we have until 2027 to still defeat China, but many think that we couldn't even defeat China now. If we talk about Ukraine being in Russia's backyard and being a strategic priority for Russia and not the United States, it's even more the case over Taiwan. Now, the U.S. does want the microelectronics and the chips from Taiwan, and the world does also. But the U.S. policy of trying to weaken China in that regard makes Taiwan an even more attractive target for China. So, I think we're living in a blind world.
Coming to our last second question, over the course of the last 4 U.S. administrations, there has been a sustained escalation in North Korea's missile tests. This trend has intensified notably in the past 3 years, with surge in testing by North Korea going up by 112%, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In Iran as well, we are seeing that Tehran is coming closer than ever to a nuclear bomb. What have we done wrong with the non-proliferation regime that we have in the world? Is this something because of multipolarity, or there is something that we as the world have done wrong, the way we approached non-proliferation, that it appears that it is dying?
Good question. First of all, North Korea's tests. They haven't carried out a nuclear test since 2017. There's been discussion of a North Korean nuclear test, but they have not done so. But they have increased the ballistic missiles. They have been testing ballistic missiles, and that's been provocative as well. The situation on the peninsula is very, very dangerous. But one of the other consequences of this security agreement between Russia and the DPRK and North Korea is that the South Korea has begun again seriously considering not trusting U.S. extended deterrence and developing its own nuclear weapons. We know that South Korea has the technological capability of developing nuclear weapons quickly. We also know that according to some of the polls, as many as 70% of the South Korean population want to see South Korea develop its own nuclear weapons. So that is definitely on the table again. And that has been spurred in part by the agreement between Russia and North Korea, number one. Number two, the Yoon government is extraordinarily unpopular. It's a right-wing government that barely got into power in the latest elections. And they behaved terribly since, and the opposition is strengthened, and the support for that Yoon regime is very, very low. So clearly, nuclear non-proliferation has not succeeded in the Korean Peninsula, and it could get worse. It could get dramatically worse. The other situation with Iran is also a mess. Obama, to his credit, negotiated with the help of Russia, the help of China, the help of Germany and others, negotiated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear ban treaty. And that was a great thing. And then Trump, was it 2018, decides to abrogate it. You have to remember that under that treaty, Iran mothballed 97% of its centrifuges. It sent 97% of its enriched nuclear material to Russia. It only enriched uranium to about 3% or 3.7%. Now, after the U.S. abrogated that treaty, Iran now has dramatically increased its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium and has been enriching up to 60%. It's restored its centrifuges to go from 60% to the 90% that's necessary for a nuclear weapon is a very easy step. The difficult step is to go from 3.7% for energy use to 60%. And so Iran certainly poses a nuclear threat. Under the JCPOA, the idea was to have a one-year breakout. It would take Iran a year to develop nuclear weapons. The estimate now is that Iran can develop nuclear weapons within a month. They don't have the technology yet to put a nuclear bomb on the tip of a missile and have it come back safely within the atmosphere, but they could develop that quickly. They have reinforced and hardened their bunkers, especially at Fordow, but also others as well. And they could certainly easily develop nuclear dirty bombs. And so the situation is very dangerous. So the big point you're making about non-proliferation having failed is true. And I put the onus of that on, at the feet of all the nuclear powers, because the 1970 NPT treaty said that the 5 recognized nuclear powers, the part of the deal was that the non-nuclear powers would commit to not developing nuclear weapons, but the nuclear powers in exchange would be committed to eliminating their nuclear weapons. And they have not done so. Yes, they brought them down, but what's happening now is that all 9 nuclear powers are modernizing, and that almost all of them have stated or are under pressure or thinking about increasing the number of nuclear weapons. So we brought it down from 70,000 to 14,000, even under 14,000, 80% reduction, and now we're talking about increasing it again. In the U.S., the Joint Congressional Bipartisan Strategic Posture Committee has called for dramatically increasing U.S. nuclear weapons. The Russians are talking about the same. China, we know, is increasing. The Brits are talking about a 40% increase in their number of nuclear weapons. We see this going on everywhere. We're going the wrong direction. So the non-proliferation regime has failed. The Third World has spoken up with the nuclear ban treaty, the TPNW. The world wants to see nuclear weapons eliminated. However, we're going the opposite direction. And we're closer than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis for nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
The bullet atomic scientist has put the doomsday clock at 90 seconds before midnight. I was cited in an article, an op-ed column in China yesterday, saying that I thought that they should move the hands of the doomsday clock to 30 seconds before midnight. I don't remember actually having said that, but I think that that would be appropriate because we're so much closer to nuclear war now than we were back even 2 or 3 years ago. So we've got 3 crises. We've got the Gaza situation, which could expand into a broader regional war in an instant. We've got the situation in Ukraine. We've got the situation with China in the Indo-Pacific. Both of them, we have the South China Sea, and we've got Taiwan. And so the world, John Kennedy said years ago at his brilliant American University commencement address, he said that to put a nuclear power in the position of either suffering a humiliating defeat or being forced to use nuclear weapons is either a colossal failure in statesmanship or a collective death wish on the part of the human species. I think this is both a colossal failure of statesmanship and a collective death wish. In Civilization is Discontents, Sigmund Freud's brilliant 1929 book, he talks about the death instinct. Says there's a life instinct and there's a death instinct. And it looks to me like on a global scale now, the death instinct is prevailing. Freud held out hope. I held out hope. But the longer these situations prevail, the more dangerous, more precarious, the more suicidal they become.
Coming to our last question, one of the target audience for this show is interns at Capitol Hill and young bureaucrats, those who would shape American foreign policy in the future. With your seniority, experience, and knowledge, what would your message be to this demographic? How do you think that this demographic should change its thinking and not repeat the errors of their elders?
I'll start by quoting Phil Oakes, the great 1960s American folk singer and anti-war hero. In his book, in his song, I Ain't Marching Anymore, says, it's always the old who lead us to the wars. It's always the young who fall. But look at all we've won with a saber and a gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? I think the younger generation, I see my students, see Biden and the policymakers who Ben Rhodes called the blob as a bunch of warmongering old fools who have rejected diplomacy. We see, back in March of 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we had the Istanbul Accords. Russia and Zelensky had effectively come to an agreement to end the fighting a month after it began in Ukraine. But Zelensky was pushed by Boris Johnson, the British clown, and by Biden and the Americans, the elder American statesman, in quotes, to reject any thinking about ending the war. He was promised they would get all the aid they needed. And where are we now? Are we better off than we would have been ending the war 2.5 years ago? No. We're worse off. We're going to be worse off 6 months from now. We'll be worse off a year from now. We're going to revisit this a year from now. And the Russians will have gained a little more ground than Ukraine. And there'll be hundreds of thousands more Ukrainian and Russian casualties. And we're going to have wasted more and more of the world's resources. And we're going to be no closer to peace. Now we're going to be at the same crisis point where we have a choice between diplomacy and continued warfare. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that we're going to be in World War III. And so you choose. The younger generation has to choose. And they have to say, that the ways of the older generation, and I mean all of those leaders, you've got Biden saying, I want to make America great again and NATO great again. We've got Putin wanting to make Russia great again. Xi Jinping wanting to make China great again. Modi wanting to make India great again. Netanyahu wanting to make Israel great again. I mean, we can go down the line. Khamenei wanting to make Iran great again. They're all fools. And you shouldn't trust them. You shouldn't think that they've got any deeper wisdom. They've shown over the last 70 years, 75 years since World War II, that they have no vision for running a peaceful and prosperous world. We need a multipolar world. We're in a multipolar world. It's time we recognize that. And we need to find peaceful solutions to these problems. And so Putin has said he wants to negotiate over Ukraine. But the West ignores his words. I say call his bluff. We're not going to end this war by sending more arms. We're not going to end this war or any of the global crises by fueling the arms races and by giving the merchants of death, the arms manufacturers, what they want. We've got to have statesmanship prevail. The U.S., I don't see any of it. I don't see it from Biden or Campbell or Blinken or Sullivan or Austin. I see them as a bunch of over-the-hill warmongers, and I think they need to all be replaced right now. And I'm not seeing that wisdom. You know where I see some of it? I see China and Brazil, Xi Jinping and Lula putting forth a 10-point peace plan. I see China's previous peace plan, their 12-point plan. Point number one is respect for national sovereignty, which is a critique of Russia and Russia's invasion. Point number two, no nation's national security should be achieved at the expense of anybody else's national security, which is a critique of the United States and NATO. I think we need a balanced approach, and I think we need to figure out how we're going to get there peacefully.
Ladies and gentlemen, you just listened to Dr. Peter Kuznick, Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Dr. Kuznick, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew, and I'm glad you're raising these kinds of questions and trying to reach future leaders, because if we survive this period, these are the ones who are going to have to create a different world, a better world.
Strategic Wisdom with Andrew Jose is an initiative of Andrew Jose Media. The views expressed by guests on this show do not necessarily represent the official positions and opinions of Andrew Jose, Andrew Jose Media, and Strategic Wisdom.
Thank you for listening to Strategic Wisdom. Be sure to follow and subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you are using to listen to this show in order to not miss out any future interviews and conversations that Andrew Jose will bring to you on this podcast. We're streaming on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Yandex, JioSaavn, Amazon Music, and many other podcast streaming services. Also, be sure to subscribe to Strategic Wisdom on Substack at strategicwisdom.substack.com and to follow Strategic Wisdom on Twitter and Instagram at StratWisdom. Do support our work by buying from our merch store. For more details, visit strategicwisdom.substack.com.
Thank you so much, Gabby, and thank you so much, Ian. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your host, Andrew Jose, signing off.